Thank you very much for coming this afternoon on this beautiful, crisp fall day in Cambridge. We're delighted to kick off the fall lecture series here at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm Anthony Flint, Fellow and Director of Public Affairs. We're joined by Greg Ingram, President of the Lincoln Institute, and we're all very happy to be here and continue this great discourse that for perhaps many of you began or continued last night with the presidential debate. And we're going to continue that conversation here, joined by Alex Marshall, who is an old friend, and we're delighted that he is here. He is a senior fellow at the Regional Plan Association in New York City, and he is author of the book that he's going to talk about, The Surprising Design of Market Economies. He also wrote two other books about cities, Beneath the Metropolis, and How Cities Work, Suburbs Sprawl and the Roads Not Taken. He's been a journalist and newspaper reporter. He's specialized in writing about infrastructure and urban planning, a domain that has led him into writing about economics. He's a regular columnist on transportation for Governing magazine, and his opinions and commentaries appeared in the op-ed pages of the New York Times, Bloomberg News. His articles have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Metropolis Magazine, the Boston Globe, and many other publications. He's taught at the New Jersey School of Architecture in Newark and holds a master's from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, and also in 1999 to 2000 was a Loeb Fellow at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. He lives in Brooklyn, and if all of that was not enough, he's also an accomplished singer and guitar player. I don't know if that's part of the program, but we welcome that as well. And so please join me in welcoming Alex Marshall.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, for that nice introduction. I wish I did have my guitar here. It would be fun and probably, maybe more fun for you than this talk. But Tony is a great guy. I've known him quite a while now. He's a former Loeb Fellow like myself. And so I'm just going to talk, no PowerPoint, see how that goes. I'm basically going to tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to talk about my book, probably talk for about 45 minutes, and then have time for questions and discussions. And I'll probably start up here and then walk around some, which I kind of like to do. And I have it all, I'm a postmodern lecturer. I have it all on my iPad. And so I'm feeling very smug about that. I'm Alex Marshall. I'm a journalist by background. Journalists are nice because, as Bill and Maury said, you sort of get to learn in public, and you get to poke into things. And often that's sort of the nature of a journalist. And I've got into writing about urban planning in cities, and that led me into economics. So I'm going to start walking now, but there's another very famous, basically she was a journalist who started out writing about cities and then wrote about economics. So anybody know who that was? Yeah. Name come to mind? So the famous Miss Jane Jacobs, and her famous book 1961, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, very influential. But then she wrote about 4 other books. The rest of her life, basically, she wrote about economics, and she wrote books like this, like The Nature of Economies. And so I've kind of gone on a similar trajectory. This is my first book, How Cities Work, and now I have one about economics. And I don't want to compare myself too closely to Jane Jacobs, because Mr. Flint here has written a book about Jane Jacobs, and he could tell me, Mr. Marshall, I knew Jane Jacobs. I was a friend of Jane Jacobs, and you, sir, are no Jane Jacobs. And I don't want that to happen to me. I guess I think it's just illustrative that there does seem to be some sort of continuum, that when you start out looking at cities and trying to understand them, it kind of leads you to start thinking about economies. And I'm not even sure exactly why that is, or all the reasons. I guess it's because cities themselves are economic entities. But that's been the nature for me. And if my work has 100th as impact as Jane Jacobs' work, well, will be very, very happy. I want to do a few thank yous first. First of all, to the Lincoln Institute, who brought me here. They've been very helpful to my career all along the way, not only directly, but through people I meet here. They do wonderful functions. They were also helpful in this particular book. In the book, I thanked them in the credits when I was delving into property rights. I interviewed Harvey Jacobs and some other Lincoln scholars, and so they were very helpful. And I know a bunch of people here, and I won't introduce them all, except Jim Stocker back there, the curator of the Loeb Fellowship. The Loeb Fellowship, as I'll mention in my talk, was enormously helpful to me. It was 12 years ago that I did the Loeb Fellowship, but I was thinking about these ideas then, and the Loeb Fellowship was actually quite helpful. I started sampling classes around Harvard University, the business school, elsewhere, and they kind of let me know I'm not crazy. They were like giving me some validation. So I'm going to talk some about my book, and but how about those debates, huh? People watch the debates last night? Y'all like that new, scrappier Obama? You know, getting in there. I approved. I approved. But one thing came up. Was this? Actually, it came up repeatedly. Was this idea of the role of government? I would say that much of the debate was about the role of government, and I think that's a particularly American debate. We have a kind of schizophrenic DNA. We were founded in reaction against the government. We rebelled against the government that we thought was oppressive, Great Britain. But we also came up with this sort of new idea that we can govern ourselves. So we both celebrate governing, and we're both hostile to it. And so that gives us to me a certain schizophrenia. Now in the debate, at one point there came Mitt Romney, who started celebrating the free enterprise system. And he said, I'm a backer of the free enterprise system. That creates jobs. Government doesn't do that. And Obama basically pretty much just said, yeah, me too. He said, I'm a believer in the free enterprise system too, and I know that government doesn't create jobs, but I have some modifications. But he didn't really say, no, I disagree with you. He certainly said, I believe in the free enterprise system. Well, I really would say the core of my book is saying, there is no such thing as a free enterprise system. That the free enterprise system, such as it is, our enterprise system, let's not call it free, is a creation of government. That our traditional separation of government over here in economies and economic and business over there is a false one. And ideas and concepts have effects. And these false concepts basically confuse us and cause us to stumble. And that we should really understand on a deep way that what we call the capitalist system or systems is created by government. And since we are a democracy, that should be part of our democracy. We should talk about, well, how do we want our capitalist system constructed? What kind of capitalist system do we want? And what are the choices? So in the book, I kind of lay out, just not a comprehensive, but just a lot of the ways government builds the deep architecture of our economy. I like that phrase, the deep architecture. And I show and then say, and this stuff is not determined by God, is not immutable, they can be changed. And I think an analogy that worked for me to help people understand the difference between sort of the free market economy and its relationship to government is Prospect Park. There's a very beautiful park near where I live in Brooklyn, and it's called Prospect Park. It was designed by Olmsted and Calvert Vaux. Many consider it their masterpiece. And as a Brooklynite, I can tell you, without bias, maybe a little bit of bias, but it's true, it's actually much better than Central Park, which was also designed by them. I mean, you walk into this park, and it's just beautiful. It has a sense of theater. You walk into it, and you go through these little tunnels, and then you're suddenly in this huge meadow that's a mile long, and you're surrounded by rolling hills, there's lakes, there's little rivers, there's wildlife, and you just go, my gosh, thank you, to those in the 19th century who preserved this wonderful piece of nature. And you go, boy, this is good. And then if you know your urban history, you realize that's completely false. You know, this wasn't preserved or protected. It was wholly created. You know, they moved the earth around. They created little mini mountains. They actually created the lakes and the rivers. They had to bring in special clay from upstate New York so that the water didn't just drain through into the ground. And then the very water supply itself is the New York City water system. The water actually comes via pipe into a waterfall and then goes through the rest of the park. And so it's wholly created. And as my friend Charles McKinney says, another Loeb fellow who's now head of parks design, you know, he said it's one gigantic potted plant. And like a potted plant, it has to be maintained and cared for. And so I think that's a great analogy for our economic system. To some extent, it works so well that we've forgotten that we've created it. We sort of walk around this and go, yeah, this is great, you know, and I can start a business and do that, and this wonderful thing called the supply of laws of supply and demand just work. But we've forgotten that, you know, the very architecture itself was created by us, and we should remember and talk about it and talk about some of the choices. So, for the heart of my talk, I wanted to make it a little bit fun. I'm going to talk about the 12 secret things that government does that aren't really secret, but that most of us, or a lot of us, have forgotten about or never realized. And you guys are so smart and educated, maybe you guys know a lot of this already, but I think a lot of people, they're not. And they're not really in any particular order. They're just a kind of series of things that are part of this deep architecture that government does. And I may speed up and slow down on them, and if I don't get through all 12, I'll stop, you know, but it's, I don't want to talk too long. I'm going to leave time for questions and discussions. So, the secret thing that government does, number one, you know, the patent system and intellectual property rights in general. Now, this really isn't sort of less of a secret than most of them. I mean, most of us know that patents and intellectual property in general is created by government. There's no such thing as sort of natural patents or something. They weren't handed down by God. They were created by government. But I don't think most of us know sort of the history of patents, and it's kind of understand in a deeper way sort of where they come from. And I think understanding that does help us understand the sort of arbitrariness of them and some of the choices implied. Now, I'm just going to talk about patents. I could talk about copyrights and trademarks because they each have their sort of own separate histories, but I'm just going to talk about patents. Now, the word patent comes from a Latin phrase, literae patent, which means an open letter, or a letter basically. And what it is, literae patent was a letter from the king, or eventually from the legislature. It was a special grant of authority from the government that allowed you to do something, or gave you special powers. And the king could give you a letter patent, for example, to go into a hostile country and have safe passage. He could give you a letter patent to sell salt and have a monopoly on it. He could give you a letter patent to reward you if you had come up with an invention, or if you had won a battle, then he would give you a letter patent to do something or have something. And governments freely dispensed these letter patents, and they eventually just started to be called patents. And they were used actually a whole lot in the New World. You often read about land patents because you were given, the king technically owned all the land, and he would give a chunk of it to a friend or a duke, and that would be a land patent. But there developed this thing called the patent system. Now, who came up with the patent system? And to that, we turn to one of my favorite places, Venice. And I got to be a fan of that island little empire and city here as a Loeb Fellow. I took this great class with Professor Eduardo Seckler at the Graduate School of Design called the Shaping and Preservation of Historic Urban Places. and he spent 2 or 3 classes on Venice, and he really got you to see how special that is. And but most of us, have some idea of Venice. It's this series of little islands within this lagoon. It's utterly fabulous in an architectural sense. But I think a lot of us don't know its history that well. And so just a little bit of its history. I mean, Venice was, Venice was a republic. It had an elected government for 1,100 years. It's really an amazing thing. The first Doge, the head of Venice, was elected in 697. And the last, who resigned when Napoleon conquered the city, was in 1797. So 1,100 years it had elected government. It's really an amazing thing. And we should study it more as Americans, because we're proud of our 200-year-old democracy. Well, they had an 1,100-year-old democracy. It was a limited franchise, but it was a democracy. And Venice dominated trade for many centuries. And one of its big weapons was its stability of government. Its stability of government allowed it to develop systems that really helped it in trade. And while its competitors had usually kings and dictators that would come and go. And one of the things that Venice developed was probably the first patent system. In 1474, some Venetian came up with this idea of having a patent system. Now, patents had been given to inventors, but it was just sort of like a favor, or it was just among the favors given for people who did nice things. And no one had ever thought of a system saying, like, if you do this, we will do that. And this Venetian came up with that idea. And if you read the actual text of the law, it's really nice. It actually says, we have among us men of great honor and inventiveness, and we should reward them. And it sort of lays down basically pretty much the way the patent system still works. It says, you will get a term of, I think it was initially 10 years, and then they changed it to 20 years, 21 years, and it was they kind of loosely based it on the guild system, and they basically said, if you invent something special, we will give you a monopoly of use on it for a fixed period of time. And it didn't create a patent bureau. You actually had to go to the Venetian Senate. But the Venetian Senate, they passed this law in 1474, and then over the next century, they awarded about 100 patents. So, it worked. But as this patent system developed, which other nations copied, the patent also continued its other use, basically, of just being given to friends and colleagues. And as I say in the book, in the 1600s, your average man was literally sort of surrounded by patents. He was you would sort of drink out of a Monopoly cup and build your house with Monopoly bricks and sprinkle Monopoly salt on your food. And the king and parliaments had been so liberal in their giving away of patents that people began to feel quite oppressed by them. And in our country, the American Revolution was in part a revolt against the overuse of patents. And that was how it was in the New World. You're kind of surrounded by all these government-sanctioned monopolies. And in our Constitution, there's a phrase that says something like, in order to advance science and invention, Congress is awarded the power to grant patents. And what's been forgotten in normal discourse is that there's a kind of subtext to that. The subtext is we don't want patents abused. We only want them given to reward science and invention. We don't want them given to reward our friends or to just here and there. And to kind of tie it back to our present day, I think we're kind of close to living back as we did in the 1600s. We're surrounded by patents now that sort of just cover everything around us. And they arguably have become much abused. They're given out too freely. People have patented a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And a famous one, Amazon got a patent for one click. The patents are given for ideas now. And a good thing is there is actual discussion of that going on. There was a great article in the Times about a month ago about this. There is some debate about this. And in the Silicon Valley, I think there was actually a movement to reduce the scope of patents. So that's a good thing. But I think, we could have more. And on patents and intellectual property in general, I don't think it's actually crazy to think of Romney and Obama like having a plank or the parties having a plank in their platforms and say, well, here's what we think of the patent system. It's one of the fundamentals of our economy. We want to keep it the way it is, or we want to change it. I don't think these things should be left to the courts or the lobbyists. I think they should, it's our patent system. It's our system of intellectual property. And we should have a hand in its design. And so that's example number one, the patent system. So example number two, another secret thing that the government does is corporations. Now, corporations are very powerful on our land. And where do corporations come from? I think we have forgotten where corporations come from. So where do corporations come from? Well, anybody know? They come from government. Corporations are holy creations of government. You get a charter that lays out what their responsibility are, what their privileges and rights are, and they come from us. And it's ironic because they become symbols of private enterprise, but and really in a kind of a fundamental way, they're not private. They're public things. And this kind of blows people's minds because it's so different from the way normally people think of corporations. It shows you this kind of amnesia that basically we have as a society. The private corporation is a relatively recent thing. When I think of a corporation, being here in Boston, like some good example of corporations are Harvard and Boston, right? Does that ring a bell? I mean, both of those are corporations. Harvard is a corporation. The city of Boston is a corporation. And as a great professor here at Harvard, law professor Gerald Frog, who's written about cities, says, we have forgotten that IBM in Albany and Google in San Francisco are the same thing. They are both corporations created by government for a purpose. And if you start to really read and understand this deep history, and again, you start to see private corporations more as what they are. Corporations used to be awarded only for very limited purposes, and usually public ones. So they were given to establish cities. Cities were corporations, universities, monasteries. Then they started to be used for things like canal companies to do a public work. And they always needed a special vote by the legislature or given by the king. You couldn't just create a corporation. You had to go to the legislature and get approval for this corporation. And so they were a very special thing because they were a grant of government power and authority. As someone said, they were mini republics. And in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, the corporation gradually began to be liberalized. And they're in a series of developments. The corporation sort of gradually began to sort of escape the leash of its masters. And a big development was, well, probably the development, was this idea and concept that you could create a corporation by right, just without getting a special approval by the legislature. You just file some stuff and you get a corporation. But even then, originally the corporations were still much more limited in power. They usually had, or often had, an expiration date. Legislatures revoked them. And a big one, you could not, a corporation could not buy another corporation. And what happened in the 19th century in the US is our structure of government, which is the many states, it encouraged a kind of race to the bottom. In the late 19th century, there was this kind of race to the bottom where different states began competing to see who could liberalize the corporate architecture the most. And for a while, New Jersey was in front. And then Delaware leaped ahead. And it was New Jersey who first allowed one corporation to buy another corporation. And then Delaware surpassed it. And so basically Delaware is the home for most of our big corporations. They're based there, even if it's, I just thought of this. They're kind of the Cayman Islands of the United States. Big companies just have like a letterbox there, but that's theoretically where the company is based. So what occurred to me, and as I say in the book, I mean, none of this is sort of unchangeable. Right now we usually base our corporations in states, but we could have national corporations, and that could be a subject of discussion. There actually are some national corporations, but they're relatively rare. There are things like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That is a national corporation. Amtrak, I believe, is a national corporation. But we still allow most corporations to be governed by the state. But that's just a choice. Most countries have something called a National Companies Act that lays out the powers and rights of corporations in that country. And we could have such a thing that would lay out a national architecture. And there are various ways to do it. You could say corporations above a certain size have to be chartered nationally, and we could have what we were supposed to have in a democracy, which is a debate, a discussion about how we construct corporations. And I think very interestingly, James Madison, as I quote this in the book, James Madison actually, he talked about this. He actually proposed a National Companies Act back in 1810 or something. He said, he sort of said on the one hand, on the other hand, he said, you know what, we really want business to be national in scope, but these things could gain too much power and threaten our democracy. So we should have a National Companies Act. And he might have even used that phrase. It's in the book, but it's something very close. We said we need a National Companies Act to both authorize them and control them. And it's a great little piece because it's not that widely known that he actually proposed that and talked about it. And we should have that debate. But first we have to kind of understand that the corporation, while it's a symbol of private enterprise, is it's ours. And we should basically bring our children home and make them work for us again. Number three, just a number three here, but we'll get there. Now, number three is a big one itself, is property itself. When I think of property, I have various images come to mind, but I think a useful one is to think of different examples of property down through the ages. A big one are slaves, right? We used to have slavery, and slaves are property. And I think slaves are good to bring up because they illustrate how property is whatever government says it is. And, if you say slavery is allowable and encourage or possible, then you have that as property. And there used to be a whole big body of law dealing with slavery because it was a creature of law and it was property, so you needed law. So there's books about what happens to slaves when they're inherited, the rights of the slave themselves, on and on and on. And when Congress finally passed the 13th Amendment and outlawed slavery, this huge body of law was just kind of swept out the door. But again, it's illustrative that property itself is produced by government. And you'll get furious debate about that among sort of libertarians, and a lot of them subscribe to this idea of John Locke of kind of natural rights, or that some sort of thing is natural law and natural property. I basically think that's all garbage. That there's no property without government. Government creates property, and get used to it. It was a good argument in the 1600s because they were trying to get power from the king, and so they were trying to argue why. It made sense. It sort of was a good political argument at the time, but it doesn't really make sense of logic. And if you look at the development of property over the centuries, what you find is that it's not a simple thing. It's not just a black and white thing, like, oh, we didn't have property, now we have property. It's actually a long series of developments, a long series of inventions, basically, by government for the most part, of sort of figuring out what this thing is and how it could work. And so there are these developments of property, and they came down. And a big one is the ownership of land. And speaking here at Lincoln, this is, of course, particularly of concern to them. They study basically, land tenure and how you control or own land. But the ownership of land was sort of particularly complex. For one thing, it was a conceptual leap, that to say you could not only own this book, but that you could own land, that a piece of land could somehow be owned and then sold. Each of those were sort of separate steps. And there were many developments, but just to mention a few. I mean, you think about it. What do you need to own? What do you need to own a piece of property, or really to own anything, but particularly property? Well, you need records. You need public records, because to own something, you can say you own anything, but you have to have something that says you own it. And it has to be inspectable. You have to have other people to see it. I mean, if you have a private record in your desk drawer that says, you own your house, and no one can see it, it doesn't really do any good. So there was a series of developments of public records that say people own things, and one sort of significant start of that was something called the Domesday Book, which is sort of more fun to call the Doomsday Book because that sounds cooler. But it was in the 1100s, after the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror, he actually sent teams of people all throughout England, and he recorded, he said, every single thing, every sheep, house, sort of farm, and he wrote it all in this huge book that was called the Domesday Book. And then he basically said, you see all this stuff? I own it. and that was significant, because it was one of the first times that ownership had been declared on such a big scale, and really almost ownership at all. I mean, people had used land, but owning it it wasn't quite there yet. And so even though sort of he owned all this stuff, it actually helped develop the system of property rights, because this Domesday Book, which still exists, there's like 3 or 4 copies in there in England, they became the public record. When people were arguing about whose farm is that or something, they would say, well, let's go to the book. Let's go to the book. And you go to the book and see. And basically, even though the king owned everything, he basically said, but you can use it if you give me rent, or if you give me taxes, or if you fight my wars. And so he gave people conditional use, and that was laid out. So this Domesday Book started the system of, helped start the system of public records that we rely on today. Another big series of developments that allow people to buy and sell land was the development of systems of measurement. And this is another quite interesting long history. There's a great book that I rely on to a large extent called Measuring America, about the development of systems of measurement, both in this country and in Europe. And when you think about it, you can't sell a piece of land unless you can survey it and measure it and have some agreed upon common system of measurement, and which is not so easy to do. Into the 1800s, systems of measurement were very diverse. There was no agreed upon standard, and which I really didn't know until reading this book. It was not just in length, but volume, and things like basically all systems measure. Like if you went to a market and bought a quart of peas, what a quart is, or a pound, and there were a whole bunch of other systems that we've forgotten, was it varied. And it varied not only from nation to nation, but town to town. What a quart was, what a pound was. It was just a general kind of category. And if you bought, it would vary even at the same market. Like if you bought a particularly nice, say, peaches, well, a quart of nice peaches would be different than a quart of not so nice peaches. And But as basically capitalism started to get bigger, there became this need for common systems of measurement. So it was a great kind of very difficult series of developments as government developed and then approved these common systems of measurement. Of course, the big one was the metric system, and there's an interesting history of that with the United States. Thomas Jefferson, I'm a native of Virginian, and I've always really loved Thomas Jefferson, and it probably helps that I'm from Virginia. But as I look into this book, it's interesting in how many chapters Thomas Jefferson pops up. He was so influential, and so he really helped construct so much of the deep architecture of this country. And but he was a big fan of this metric system, and he wanted the United States to be a part of it. And it was actually all set up to happen. It was all agreed upon. He had been to France and as ambassador and met all these scientists, and he had sort of done the American version of that, and it was all set to approve. And then the French Revolution happened. And the French Revolution kind of screwed everything up for two reasons. One, it contaminated the metric system with this idea that it was a kind of leftist revolutionary thing. But the other was the French itself. As a lot of you probably know, the current metric system is based on the distance from Paris to, I think it's the North Pole, or maybe it's the equator. But it's based on a length from Paris to somewhere. That was not the original idea. The original idea was to have it on the length of a pendulum swing, a certain length of pendulum, and at sea level. And it would have been very easily replicated all over the world. And what happened was that there was the French Revolution. The main scientists, French scientists who developed this, they basically were threatened to have their heads cut off. they basically said, let's have something more nationalistic. And they changed it. And that kind of infected it. So Britain and the United States backed out of the deal and didn't approve the metric system. We did, however, approve our own system, which was not easy. And again, I guess to me, as someone who has studied cities and cares about politics, what's kind of fascinating is that none of this stuff is easy. None of it just happens. It usually takes decades of work, and it took decades of work to develop what we think of today as the yard and the foot and just our common systems. It was under an office of Congress, started with Jefferson, and then moved on to this other guy, and ultimately fell to this one kind of fanatically intense guy who worked on it for like 40 years. And he went to Britain and had these, basically you have to agree on what a yard is, and then you have to get someone to make you a yard. And it's weird, but that's actually difficult. It's quite difficult. He had to go to Britain to get these special, incredibly precise machines that would build him some yards that could be a standard. And I think it wasn't just yards, he did some other ones. But and then he brought those back to America and then made really good copies of that and distributed them to the states so that basically people could have a standard. And then eventually you get down to buying yardsticks at the drugstore. And but it took a lot of work on the part of politics and government. I wanted to say one thing about Jefferson that I didn't mention. He did not get his metric system through, but he did get another metric system through that relates to money, which is our dollar, our system of money. That Jefferson personally developed that. He personally designed it, and he got it through Congress. And it's pretty neat. When we have a dollar bill, you're basically spending Thomas Jefferson's idea. It wasn't the original plan. Being a British colony, we used English pounds and pennies and things like that. So it was kind of thought, well, we just have American pounds, and it would just kind of carry over the English system, and that would have been a natural thing to do. But Jefferson was a creature of the Enlightenment, and he loved the rationality of the metric system. So he personally designed this whole coinage system. And he got that part through Congress, and so that's kind of neat. So I started out talking about property, and then got into measurement. It's obviously a complex world, but property itself is a creation of government. And this kind of get off my property government, it doesn't make sense when you think about it. I mean, you're asking the government to get off your property, but government creates the property. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't treat people fairly, but there should be a deeper understanding that property itself is a social good, a political good, and that it's basically decided in common, and what property is, should be debated and discussed by we the people. So I have a chapter on common law, which is a really interesting system. I think of it as kind of a secret system because I think most people are only vaguely aware of its existence. I have some suspicions about it. It's a uniquely Anglo-Saxon thing, a common law. And so what is common law? Usually it's called lex non scripta. It's unwritten law. It's law developed through the courts and not actually written down in any one particular place. It's based on case law. And not written by the legislature. And it sort of, as a good American, it kind of offended me to the more I understood it, because as a child, I learned this basic rule, basic system that legislature creates laws, the executive carries it out, and the courts enforce it. Pretty simple. But common law is this immense body of law, probably larger than the written law. It's all carried down from England, and it's very difficult to change. It is conceivable, as with slavery, you could do something so overruling that it just sort of utterly changes it. But for the most part, it's sort of off limits to the legislature. There's so much of it, and it's kind of like trying to control an amoeba, because as soon as you do one thing, it sort of pops up over there. And that's a big subject of discussion. Can we sort of make common law more a creature of democracy rather than just the courts? And I won't go too much into that because it's a big subject, but I do have a chapter about it in my book. So number 5 is what I call alternative systems of capitalism. Government can develop alternative systems of capitalism. And one alternative system that I like, in which I have a chapter on, are cooperatives. Now, any of y'all familiar with cooperatives, co-ops? You probably can think of a few here. There we go. Can anyone think of an example of some common co-ops that we live with? Most of us, daily or weekly?
Farm Bureau is a cooperative.
Yeah, Farm Bureau. But I'm thinking of something even more ordinary. Is basically when you go to the grocery store. You're surrounded by the products of co-ops. A big one, there's Organic Valley Milk, but there's Ocean Cranberry, there's Sunkist Raisins, and one of the big ones is Land O'Lakes Butter. And I really like Land O'Lakes Butter. It's good butter. And but it is a product of a co-op, and most people I think don't realize that. The Land O'Lakes is actually a special thing. It's a cooperative of cooperatives. It's owned by thousands of smaller cooperatives, which in turn are owned by thousands of farms. And so when you're buying this butter, you're buying the butter of a gigantic cooperative. And there are really a lot of cooperatives around that are big companies. There's Ralston Purina is a cooperative. A lot of big oil distributors that are important. Cooperatives, I think, are really interesting and special for a bunch of reasons. One is that they work differently than standard, I don't want to say standard, but the variety of capitalism that we're accustomed to. And it took me what I did for this book, and I went up to the land of cooperatives, which is Minnesota and Wisconsin. It's all these Scandinavians. And Scandinavians have been using cooperatives for many hundreds of years. And so when they came to this country, they just sort of naturally started doing cooperatives here. And as someone in my book says, they learned a long time ago, it pays to work together. And so it's basically the land of cooperatives, and it's really interesting. You can basically live your whole life there relying on cooperatives. You go to a hospital and give birth in a cooperatively run hospital. You get your telephone service and electricity through a cooperative. Your farm runs through various cooperatives, and they work very well. But to me, as not being a creature of that, I had a lot of difficulty understanding how cooperatives are different and what are they. And to me, it's telling that it took me so long to understand them. I felt really stupid. I was always like going, well, what? Tell me again. And I think it's because the mental architecture of capitalism is as important as the kind of legal structure. We have these sort of divisions in our mind that help us function day to day. What makes a cooperative different is that it's a form of democratic capitalism. I think this is probably the key difference. In a cooperative, first of all, you can only be an owner of a cooperative if you're a, quote, user. For a Land O'Lakes Butter, a producer cooperative, you have to be a producer to be a member or an owner of Land O'Lakes Butter. You have to sell it butter. And of course, it sells other products too. What makes it democratic is that, now here's the really big deal. In Land O'Lakes Butter, the farmer with a 100-acre farm or 10-acre farm has the same voting rights as the farmer with 100,000 acres. The guy who sells Land O'Lakes, 100 pounds of butter a week has the same vote as someone who sells at 100,000 pounds of butter. It's not a company. It's not a company that functions. Most companies, they functions by the dollar. If you own more shares, then you get more votes. It's not how it works with cooperatives. The little guy has as much vote as the big guy. And what that does is that it keeps the company working in the interest of everybody, and of the smaller producer as well as the larger producer. It also keeps the bigger guys from taking over the little guys. And it does a variety of other really interesting things. It sort of reverses a lot of the normal rules of companies or capitalism. If you think about it, Land O'Lakes, because they're owned by their producers, the company is trying to pay its farmers as much as possible for every pound of butter. And the farmer, because he owns that, he's actually trying to give them good butter. And Land O'Lakes actually quite often wins, butter contest. Now, a regular company that is reversed. If you're a sort of a normal butter company, and I have to pick another example. If you're a normal butter company, you're trying to pay your farmer as little as possible. And if you're a farmer, you're trying to sell them as low quality as possible, because you're trying to produce goods as cheaply as you can. And a cooperative reverses that. The company you're selling to is yourself, so they're trying to pay you a lot, and it actually, what's interesting is that it functions really well. And what's interesting is that it is still capitalism. This is not a lefty form of socialism. It's a form of capitalism. Yes?
Habits a form of that? Because
Yeah.
I understand they control most of the milk purchasing in Vermont.
Yes, Cabot's is a cooperative. A lot of the newer organic companies are cooperatives. And within the co-op world, there's actually a sort of vaguely left-right split, which is not, but it's not really serious. It's just sort of more historical. Like Land O'Lakes, they tend, at least used to be, they may not be true anymore. They used to be more Republicans because there's sort of these conservative farmers, but then there's the Organic Valleys and others, and maybe a little more democratic, but they all get along with each other pretty well. Cooperatives, they fix a lot of the things that bedevils our regular form of capitalism. They're actually, interestingly, they're more stable. Land O'Lakes has been around a long time. They tend to not to have the wild swings that you see in a conventional capitalism. They don't have the, it's interesting, the CEOs of these cooperatives, they don't have those enormous salaries that happened in regular companies, because the membership just wouldn't approve it. They wouldn't approve $10 million for some CEO. The head of Land O'Lakes, which is a multi-billion-dollar company. I can't remember what he makes, but it's not outrageous. It's a very healthy salary, but it's not $10 million. Cooperatives function really well in the healthcare arena, which I think is particularly something worth knowing. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, a lot of the healthcare is provided by cooperatives. So it means when you go see a doctor, he is your employee. You're paying that doctor's salary. He works for you, and it reverses the normal logic of healthcare. The whole healthcare company, the cooperative, they're trying to give you the best healthcare at the lowest possible price because you're the owners. So they want to give you really good healthcare, but they really want to keep the cost down because you're the owner. Now, it's totally opposite on the other healthcare company. They never say this, but essentially they're trying to give you as little healthcare and get the most money in for it. And cooperatives are a great model for healthcare. And in the healthcare debates, they did briefly come up. But the problem was, I think, is that for people who aren't Scandinavians and don't live in Minnesota and Wisconsin, they're just really hard to understand. Even though they're actually simple, it's just you keep saying, well, the owner is the user. Or the user, it just doesn't really make sense to people at first, and it's a long road to understand that. So I would like there to be more discussion of cooperatives, but it's also recognized it's just one alternative model of capitalism. There are others, and we could promote cooperatives the way we do conventional capitalism. So I'm just going to give you a series of ways that governments sort of make markets. That's one phrase I use a lot, the way they make markets. A big way is physical infrastructure, and that's what first led me to thinking about this subject. Transportation systems are a biggie. Government has historically and long built roads, ports, then canals, train lines, airports. Transportation seems to be an arena that even here there's some agreement that government needs to play a role. And I like to say that transportation is kind of like education, is that it's publicly funded, but it gives benefits to everyone. And I'm going to move quickly on to education. Education is another example of the way government builds markets. And as Professor Bruce Scott over at the Harvard Business School said, it's one way to think of education is a giant producer subsidy. It's a giant subsidy to business. Because they no longer have to teach their employees to read and write. The government does it. And it's also good for the citizens to learn. And education, fascinating history. And it's an honor to be standing here in Massachusetts because Massachusetts was continually a leader in this idea of public education. Horace Mann, Secretary of Education in Massachusetts back in the 1830s, he really led the way for Massachusetts and others. And what was the idea? What was the big idea? The big idea was something called common schooling, which eventually came to be known as public schools. The idea that everyone would have a right to go to school, even if they could not afford it. This was a big idea, very, very difficult. And again, we should remember this, and we get tired of talking about healthcare or something. And discussions back in the 1830s and 20s and 10s and 40s were very similar to healthcare today, which I find fascinating. There was enormous disagreement over this idea that I should pay for your child to be educated. People really got upset about that. And it took a lot of work. In the initial days of the revolution, there had been lots of slogans like, common education for everybody. But when it actually came down to actually voting money, to paying for it, very controversial. And they actually got pushback from a lot of interesting quarters. A lot of the churches opposed it. Churches had been the schoolers, and they saw this as kind of threatening their turf. But a lot of it just people didn't want to pay for someone else's child. And there became one big moment in Pennsylvania, which was another early leader. This Thaddeus Stevens, who was later lead the radical Republicans in Congress. He stood up and said, we just spent some money, public money, to improve the breeding of hogs. And we should spend some money to improve the breed of man. And he gave a stirring speech, and he convinced the Pennsylvania legislature to devote money for public schools. But public schools were just the first step. A few decades later, it became another big thing is to require kids to go to school, compulsory public schooling. And you think about it, then the state is actually entering your house, taking your child, and putting them into school. And I believe Massachusetts was the first to pass those laws, which was in the 1850s. But that was a very controversial law, and it wasn't until the 20th century that every state in the country had compulsory public schooling laws. And they usually were very mild. It was only for the first few grades or a few months a year. And I think that's where we are at with healthcare. I think, talk about this in the book, a kind of theory of infrastructure. It's an interesting word, infrastructure. I think it's the word we use for the things we do in common. And what we define as infrastructure changes from century to century and decade to decade. In the 1820s, schooling was not seen as infrastructure. Interestingly, water was not seen as as infrastructure. If you wanted a glass of water, that was your responsibility. Go get yourself a glass of water. Don't look for me for it. And there was a series of big political battles to develop public water systems. And they were very controversial at first. Now they're accepted. And so I think that's what we're doing with healthcare. We're having this debate. Should healthcare be part of the things that we do in common? Should it be part of our infrastructure? I mean, I think it should, because I think the history shows that sort of the more we do in common, the more as we define infrastructure up, we actually are better off as a society. It's easier to run a business if your employee can read and write, if he's not going to get sick, if he has some clean water to drink. It's not antagonistic to capitalism or the markets. I had some stuff about policing. Language is very interesting. Government plays a much larger role than we think of in developing actually a common language. International law is another big area. All the thousands and thousands of laws that actually govern our interactions across borders. That could actually, again, be a healthier subject of discussion. I think basically in conclusion, I'd like us to think about markets and economies differently. And I think if we did, that would help us create better ones. I think typically, we kind of think of markets as down here. And these are markets. And they're sort of like the law of gravity or something, or physics. They kind of operate by themselves, and these wonderful laws like supply and demand. And then you have government, who comes in here and kind of regulates them and channels it and controls it. And I don't think that's a really useful way to think about things. I think what's actually more correct, I mean, all of this is an analogy. We shouldn't get too caught up with semantics, but as you have kind of down here, you have kind of desire. You have, we want things like food and shelter and other stuff. And, and then you have government emerge. And then it's government that creates things like property laws and corporations and patents and roads and all the things. And then you have markets up here. And so I think that would be a more useful way to think of it. I did want to say that the book is available down the street. I found it at the Porter Square bookstore last night. And then I'm told it's also at the Harvard bookstore. And so I urge you to check it out and spread the word about it. So with that, I'll take some questions.
Is that idea of copyright peculiarly an Anglo-Saxon concept?
I think yes, basically. I think the Anglo-Saxon world bifurcates government and property, or government and economy, more than the continent and other lands in Asia. And I think that goes to the unique history of Great Britain, which in a lot of ways mimics that of the United States. This, going back to the Magna Carta, the way the nobles revolted against the king and made the king sign this thing called the Magna Carta that limited the powers of the king and gave the nobles certain rights. And we kind of carried that dialogue down to the present. But it kind of sets up a bifurcation of government. So, I mean, it's a certain kind of schizophrenia. And so I think because of that, there tends to be this separation between kind of economics and government, even though the links are not secret. They actually are there, but yeah. So yes, basically yes. I think what's also interesting is that Anglo-Saxon economies have common characteristics. And I think a lot of this is from common law, which is one of these deep architecture systems. But Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, I believe also, India, Singapore, they have this. Their roots from Great Britain shape them in a lot of ways.
I find myself thinking a lot about sustainability, how we maintain prosperity within the requirements of becoming a sustainable planet. So basically, the way I'm kind of looking at what you've done is you've taken a lot of history, you've put together an interesting description of what that is, but one of the things I find myself struggling with is a prescription that would serve in sustaining prosperity in the face of the demands of sustainability.
Yeah.
And so anything to offer?
Yeah, my book is inherently descriptive and less prescriptive. And kind of like my first book, I feel like if we kind of understand things better, then that will shape the prescriptions. I mean, if we actually start talking about what kind of markets we want, that's a different question. And I think it's a question a lot of people don't want us to have. Because just by asking that question, you're going, well, wait a minute, that's a different kind of question. But as far as an environment, there's a good book I just started reading yesterday. It's called Owning Our Future, and by Marjorie Kelly. She's at the Tellus Institute. A lot of similarities in general to my book, not different, but she goes into ownership, and she basically shows that ownership is a creature of law and of society, but that there are many different ways of ownership. And she goes into cooperatives, for example. But on the environment, I think she makes a good argument that ownership is basically helpful if it's constructed right. So on the environment, if we could shape ownership systems better, that would get us to that objective. And he mentioned that there's some lawsuits that are trying to say we collectively own the atmosphere or the air above us. Because if you could sort of say we own it, then you could start sort of, having consequences for people who pollute it. And so that's one avenue.
The Spanish had a different way of distributing land in South America, which actually is antagonistic towards private ownership. And then I heard that it was some English that went into Georgia, say Savannah or something like that, who actually started the first idea of private ownership of land, which is separate from the idea that the king has a lend-lease situation in England, which means that the royalty, especially say in the City of London, always controls the land and allows you to do X, Y, Z on it, but it actually never really gives up the control of it. Yeah. Whereas in the United States, it's kind of flipped from that standpoint, and you actually do have the privacy arrested from the state, except in cases of eminent domain.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and I don't know all the history of Spain, but I do discuss in the book that it was at the time of the American Revolution, it was on paper that King George, he owned everything. He owned all the land, and including everything west of the Rockies or west of the Appalachian Mountains, but even east of it, it was again, like you say, it was kind of like a lend-lease, and that had almost become, in some parts a dead letter already, but it was still technically true. But with the revolution, then it became really not true. And And you know, and a big thing what the revolution is about, to phrase it a bit more harshly, is that we wanted to take all that land away from him. You know, we wanted that land. And he had forbidden the surveying of land west of the Appalachian Mountains. And he said, you know, I don't want to go there yet. And it's my land, and I get to say what happens to it. And we really disagreed with that. And so once we won the Revolutionary War, there was this land rush, basically. And that's where those systems of surveying and measurement come in that Thomas Jefferson helped develop. Now, Thomas Jefferson actually developed the system used to survey and measure all that land. Taking something called Gunther's chain, which was a system used in England, and then mixing it with this sort of vague metric thing. And he personally came up with this measurement system that mapped out all the land and allowed it to be sold, because it made land into a commodity. And you know, some people would get upset by that, because it makes land really different when it's a commodity. But that's what it did. It made it into something that could be bought and sold. And interestingly about Thomas Jefferson, he really wanted he wanted it to be available to the small landowners. And he worked very hard for that. And he was only partially successful, because essentially big business stepped in. And a group of consortium developed that bought up millions of acres through their friends in Congress, and took control of it. But they weren't completely successful, because Jefferson worked very hard.
There are rules established by the government, but people out of need start transacting against these rules, and the government has to come over and legitimize what people are actually doing. Typically Cuba, for instance, with land, or informal occupation of land throughout Latin America, so that the law and the government intervention comes after the market, not before the market. So the transactions are so
I think that's true, and I don't want to get too dogmatic about government making markets. I do think it's generally true, but certainly in people who already understand the system of buying and selling will start to do it on their own. But I think to a degree what they do mimics government. Like, I think the mafia could be accurately described as private government. You know, it basically functions like a government for illegal business. They control trade. They have the rules, and you know, they try to have a monopoly on violence, which is what government does. They say, you know, we are the violent ones, and if you don't obey our rules, then you know, they do it. And so yeah, there is the drug lords. Yeah, they're kind of private. They're almost like private governments, and they're really acting the way they act with each other is the way, say, England and France and the United States acted in the 18th and 19th century, you know, when they fought and warred over turf. And so they're acting like governments that way, or nations.
How has your work been received by academic economists? Are they interested at all?
Yes, yes, and I mean, I'd like someone to really argue with me, and I haven't actually had that yet. I'm looking forward to it, but I'm speaking to the economics department at Rutgers at the end of the month, so it'll be interesting to see how they react. I would think someone would get very upset, but the guy I know in the Rutgers economic department, he really likes what I've written. He's invited me to speak. He's an economist, and he says, yeah, this is great. I know that there, you know, Douglas North, he was an economist. He developed a system. He said, you know, of institutional economics, saying that institutions are important, and he comes at it in a much more complicated way, basically, and I like his work. I would think these big libertarian-style economists would really disagree with me, but I actually haven't had a good argument yet, except with sort of non-economist libertarians. And for non-economist libertarians, it's very hard for them to grasp the concept. It just keeps reverting back to, oh, you're talking about government regulating markets. And that's one thing I would like to stop talking about regulating markets. I want to start talking about designing them. I think that puts us in a better place. Yeah, so I haven't had a good argument yet. If you introduce me to some economics departments, that'd be great.
Afraid I don't have the entree for that, but I'd be really curious to see what they have to say.
My example is to try to figure out how to tell this story to my Ohio high school classmates who tend to believe that even though they have a public education and that some of them get a very nice stipend from the government for their work that they did for the Navy for a lifetime, that the government is doing no good whatsoever. I'm not sure how they're going to continue to get their patients through their retirement if the government disappears, but they would like to see that happen. I'm trying to think about how to make your case to people who are completely in the other camp.
Yeah.
Have you had that argument?
Yeah, and I've thought a lot about it. I mean, I've thought a lot about it. I just try to point out these really fundamental things that people don't think about. Things like, like corporations, like, while the government, like government, will government create corporations? Sort of. But I mean, I think a easy one, or although maybe not quite, is a little problem. Is get a drink of water. Like, you like being able to turn on your faucet and have a drink of water? Yeah. Well, most places that's a public water system. And in most places that actually was a big battle. So you say,
I think part of what would help the conversation with the traditional economics audience would be to sort through and name the conditions under which things work better, and you have to define what you mean by better when you call some things infrastructure versus not infrastructure. When is the government, and economists have discussions about when markets fail and externalities and the sort of conditions under which, but I think we're sort of missing more sort of fundamental discussion about, people have to recognize the government's doing a lot of things. Well, why do you accept it here and not here? And I think naming those conditions would help a lot. I feel the same way about the federal versus state government, that we're having a lot of conversations about, well, the federal government shouldn't do this. That's fine if the state government. Well, nobody's really talking very clearly about, well, why is that? When would the federal government be more effective or less effective? And I'm waiting for, in the debate, somebody to make a ringing endorsement of situations in which the federal government can do it better. But there's this sort of implicit, and I think you're addressing a lot of this in your book, there's an implicit acceptance that there are all sorts of things, yes, of course the government should do, but then we don't think about those principles of when. And I think in general there's hostility to the government allocating resources or imposing restraints on the private sector's ability to allocate. A lot of it has to do with allocating resources and how far into that or out of that is the government.
Yeah,
But it's I appreciate your contribution to sort of some conceptual frameworks for clarifying the discussion, because I think it's very much needed.
No, I think it's good stuff, and I do have some discussion in the book about the evolution of economics and economists. And until the late 19th century, it was political economy. It was called political economy, and there became in the 19th century, mostly under Marshall, it was like one person called it physics envy. They became fascinated with this idea that economics could be viewed as a science. And they basically started to mimic physics, and they started to look more at distribution than at producing. Distribution, you can kind of just have supply and demand and have these neat laws, and not rather look at what produces the goods, and not look at the choices that are involved before that. And so I think that's something that needs to be corrected.
One element of property in which the government is very involved, and is sort of a hidden or slightly hidden part of this election, is the inheritance laws. Yeah. Where in Napoleonic countries and in Louisiana, property is divided among all the children, or all the male children. Gives you a very different economic and social structure versus England, which land stays with the oldest male child and doesn't get divided, and therefore you have incredible, I would say excessive personally stability, whereas on the other side in France you've got excessive fractionization and loss of utility in the land, and that's all controlled at a governmental level how that's done. And inheritance taxes, which are kind of a minor undercurrent in the election debate, to me, are really part of the question: are we going toward England, traditional England, or more equal and changing economic structure?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, it sounds like you know stuff I don't. Is in Louisiana, in the Napoleonic Code, still today, is the property has to be divided up? You can't just say, oh, I want it all to go to this guy. You sort of.
Well, I'm not sure I can say has to, but the default mechanism, property is divided among all the children,
Isn't
or
that the default
all the male
mechanism
children.
here, though? I mean, as well now. I mean, I know it used to be different, but isn't that the default mechanism now that it's divided among the children, unless you say otherwise?
The state law would be.
But the underlying code is not.
It's not, yeah. Anyway, those are you're right. Inheritance law in ways kind of like slavery. I mean, not that it's bad or good, but we created the system that we accept because the law says so. But there's nothing that says that has to be the case.
It is to extent moral, the right thing to do in one culture versus another. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, well, we've reached 1:30, which is when we typically try to wrap things up, but I would encourage, if you're willing, for a few more moments,
Yeah, sure.
anyone please come up and chat with Alex, and again, please join me in again thanking Alex Marshall.